They said Eric Clapton was too young to join their band. What they didn't know was that they had just rejected the future guitar god who would change rock music forever. It was a cold October afternoon in 1961, and 16-year-old Eric Clapton was standing outside a small rehearsal room above Murphy's Music Shop in Ripley, Surrey. His hands were trembling, but not from the cold. In 15 minutes, he would audition for the Roosters, the most established band in the local music scene, and he knew this could be his one shot at becoming a real musician. Eric had been playing guitar for less than 2 years, teaching himself by listening to blues records and copying the licks of his heroes like Big Joe Williams and Muddy Waters. He spent every free moment with his guitar, practicing until his fingertips bled, driven by an obsession that his friends and family couldn't understand. At Kingston College of Art, where he was supposed to be studying, Eric was known as the quiet kid who carried a guitar case everywhere and spent lunch breaks practicing in empty classrooms. His teachers complained that he was more interested in music than his studies, and they were right. Eric knew that art school was just something he was doing to keep his grandparents happy. His real passion, his real calling, was music. The Roosters were exactly the kind of band Eric dreamed of joining. They played real blues and R&B, not the pop music that dominated the radio. The band consisted of 4 musicians in their early 20s, Tom McGinnis on rhythm guitar, Ben Palmer on piano, Robin Mason on drums, and they desperately needed a lead guitarist to complete their lineup. Eric had heard about the audition through the local music shop grapevine. The owner of Murphy's Music Shop, where Eric bought his guitar strings and spent hours browsing through imported blues records, had mentioned that the Roosters were looking for a guitarist. Eric had worked up the courage to ask for more details, and somewhat reluctantly, the shop owner had given him the time and place. "They're looking for someone with experience," the shop owner had warned him. "Someone who can really play, not just a kid messing around with a guitar." But Eric was determined to try. He had been playing guitar with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. His grandmother, who had raised him since he was 2 years old, often complained about the noise coming from his room at all hours. His school friends couldn't understand why he preferred practicing guitar to going out to parties or socializing. What they didn't understand was that for Eric, the guitar wasn't just a hobby or even an ambition. It was everything. It was his voice, his identity, his way of making sense of the world. When he played, he felt connected to something larger than himself, something that transcended his shy, awkward teenage existence. As Eric climbed the narrow stairs to the rehearsal room, he could hear music coming from behind the door. The Roosters were already playing, working through a Muddy Waters number that Eric knew by heart. He stood outside for a moment, listening, trying to calm his nerves and figure out how he would fit into their sound. When the music stopped, Eric took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Eric opened the door and stepped into a small, cramped room filled with amplifiers, guitars, and the 4 members of the Roosters. They looked older than he had expected, more professional, more serious about their music than the teenagers he was used to playing with at school. "You must be Eric," said Tom McGinnis, the rhythm guitarist who seemed to be the band's leader. "We heard you play guitar." "Yes, sir," Eric replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The 4 musicians looked at each other, and Eric could see them taking in his appearance. He was clearly younger than they had expected, probably younger than they wanted. His hair was still cut in the conservative style his grandmother preferred, and he was wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as a schoolboy rather than a serious musician. "How old are you, son?" asked Ben Palmer, the piano player. 16, Eric admitted, knowing that his honesty might end the audition before it began. 16? Repeated Robin Mason, the drummer. "Christ, you're just a kid." Eric felt his heart sink, but Tom McGinnis held up a hand to quiet the others. "Well, you're here now," Tom said. "Let's hear what you can do. Can you play Hoochie Coochie Man?"
Eric nodded, though he was so nervous he wasn't sure he could remember how to hold a guitar, let alone play one of Muddy Waters' most famous songs. Tom handed him a Fender Telecaster and pointed to an amplifier in the corner. "Plug in and show us what you've got," Tom said. "We'll back you up." As Eric plugged in the guitar and adjusted the amplifier settings, he tried to calm his racing heart. This was it, his chance to prove that age didn't matter, that he belonged in this room with these older, more experienced musicians. The opening riff of Hoochie Coochie Man was simple enough, but Eric knew simple didn't mean easy. The blues was all about feel, about bending notes with emotion, about making every phrase count. He had practiced this song hundreds of times in his bedroom, but playing it alone was completely different from playing it with a full band. Eric counted off the song and began to play. From the first note, something magical happened. All of his nervousness disappeared, replaced by the pure joy and intensity that he felt whenever he truly connected with his instrument. His fingers found the frets with confidence, his bending and vibrato were perfect, and his timing locked in perfectly with the rhythm section. The four members of the Roosters looked at each other in amazement. This wasn't the tentative, amateur playing they had expected from a 16-year-old kid. This was mature, sophisticated guitar work that showed not just technical skill, but deep understanding of the blues tradition. Eric played through the first verse and chorus, then launched into a guitar solo that demonstrated everything he had learned from listening to Muddy Waters, Big Joe Williams, and Robert Johnson. His phrasing was confident, his tone was perfect, and his emotional connection to the music was undeniable. When he finished the song, the room went silent. The four older musicians stared at him, clearly impressed, but also clearly uncomfortable with what they had just heard. Finally, Tom McGinnis spoke up. That was really good, Eric. Really good."
Eric felt a surge of hope. Maybe his age wouldn't matter after all. Maybe they would judge him on his playing rather than his birth certificate. "But," Tom continued, and Eric's heart sank as he heard that word, "you're just too young, son." "What do you mean?" Eric asked, though he already knew what was coming. "Look, you can really play," said Ben Palmer. "No question about that. But we're trying to build a serious band here. We play in pubs, we're looking to get gigs at clubs, maybe even record some music. You're 16 years old. You probably can't even get into half the places we play." "Plus," added Robin Mason, "what happens when your parents find out you're staying out until 2 in the morning playing music? What happens when your schoolwork suffers? We can't have a band member whose grandmother is calling us up complaining about keeping you out too late." Eric felt his face burning with embarrassment and disappointment. Everything they were saying was probably true, but it felt so unfair. He could play better than guitarists twice his age, but none of that mattered because of something completely beyond his control. "Come back in a couple of years," Tom said, trying to soften the blow. "When you're 18, maybe 19. Finish school, get a little more life experience under your belt. You've got real talent, but talent isn't everything. You need to be ready for the professional music world." Eric unplugged the guitar and handed it back to Tom without saying a word. He was afraid that if he tried to speak, his voice would crack and he would embarrass himself even further. "Don't take it personally," Tom called as Eric headed for the door. "It's not about your playing. You're just not ready yet." Eric walked down the stairs and out onto the street, feeling like his world had collapsed. He had played better than he ever had before, and it still wasn't enough. The one thing he cared about most in the world, the one thing he was good at, apparently didn't matter if you weren't the right age. As he walked home through the streets of Ripley, Eric made a decision that would change the course of rock history. Instead of being discouraged, instead of accepting that he needed to wait until he was older, Eric decided to prove the Roosters wrong. He would find another band, a band that cared more about musical ability than age. He would practice even harder, become even better, make himself impossible to ignore. And someday, when the Roosters realized what they had passed up, it would be too late. That night, Eric went home and practiced guitar for 6 straight hours. He worked on his bending, his vibrato, his rhythm playing, and his soloing. He played until his fingers were raw and his amplifier was too hot to touch. Over the next few months, Eric threw himself into music with an intensity that worried his family and teachers. He barely attended his art classes, spending most of his time either practicing guitar or seeking out other young musicians who shared his passion for blues and R&B. In early 1962, just 4 months after the Roosters' rejection, Eric found what he was looking for. He connected with a group of musicians who were forming a band called the Yardbirds, and they didn't care that he was still only 16. They cared that he could play guitar like someone twice his age.
The Yardbirds were different from the Roosters in every way that mattered. They were younger, hungrier, and more willing to take risks. They saw Eric's youth not as a liability, but as an asset. He brought fresh energy and a deep knowledge of blues music that impressed musicians much older than himself. By the summer of 1962, the Yardbirds were playing regular gigs around London, and Eric was developing a reputation as one of the most promising young guitarists in the British blues scene. Music industry insiders were starting to take notice of the teenage guitarist who played with the passion and skill of a seasoned professional. Word of Eric's success with the Yardbirds eventually reached the Roosters. Tom McGuinness heard through the local music network that the kid they had rejected was now playing with one of London's hottest new bands. In the spring of 1963, almost 2 years after they had turned him down, Tom McGuinness called Eric. "Eric, it's Tom from the Roosters," he said. "I've been hearing great things about what you're doing with the Yardbirds." "Thank you," Eric replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Listen, we made a mistake 2 years ago. We should have given you a chance. We're looking for a new lead guitarist, and we'd love to have you consider joining us." Eric was quiet for a moment. 2 years earlier, this phone call would have been a dream come true. The Roosters had been everything he thought he wanted in a band. But 2 years of rejection, hard work, and success had changed Eric's perspective completely. "I appreciate the offer," Eric said finally, "but I'm happy where I am. We could offer you better money than you're making with the Yardbirds, better gigs, more professional opportunities. It's not about money. It's about playing music with people who believe in you." After he hung up the phone, Eric sat quietly for a few minutes, thinking about how much his life had changed since that October afternoon in 1961. The rejection that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the best thing that could have happened to him. If the Roosters had accepted him when he was 16, he might have been satisfied being a local musician playing small venues around Surrey. Instead, their rejection had pushed him to dream bigger, work harder, and ultimately achieve far more than he ever could have with them. The Yardbirds went on to become one of the most influential bands of the 1960s, launching not just Eric's career, but also the careers of future guitar legends Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. Eric's time with the band taught him everything he needed to know about performing, recording, and being a professional musician.
When Eric eventually left the Yardbirds to form Cream and later pursued his solo career, he became one of the most respected and successful guitarists in rock history. His influence on popular music was immeasurable, inspiring countless musicians and earning him a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 separate times. The Roosters, meanwhile, never achieved the success they had hoped for. They remained a local band playing the same small venues, never breaking through to the larger music scene. Tom McGuinness eventually joined other bands and had a respectable career, but he never forgot the 16-year-old kid whose potential they had failed to recognize. Years later, in interviews about his early career, Eric would often reference that first rejection as one of the most important moments in his musical development. "Getting turned down by the Roosters was the best thing that ever happened to me,"
Eric said in a 1970s interview. It taught me that I couldn't rely on anyone else to give me opportunities. I had to create them myself. The story of Eric Clapton's first audition became legendary in music circles, a cautionary tale about the danger of judging potential based on irrelevant factors like age or appearance. It reminded industry professionals that talent doesn't always come in the package you expect. But for Eric himself, the rejection served a different purpose. It taught him that setbacks could become setups for comebacks, that closed doors could lead to better opportunities, and that sometimes the people who say no to you are actually doing you the biggest favor of your life. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a future legend is being told they're not ready yet.